Welcome to Idea to IPO. My name is Rob. I organize Idea to IPO. We've been doing events in Silicon Valley for many years. We launched officially on February 1st, 2010. At that time, we had no members and no events on our calendar. At this stage, we have over 100,000 members among all our meetup groups all around the world. We've organized, promoted, and produced over 2,398 events. By any standard, by any measure, we're the most active, most prolific startup event organization in the history of Silicon Valley, bar none. We produce venture capital panels, legal workshops, networking events, and more. These days, we're 100% online. We have an event nearly every day of the week. Check out our schedule at ideatoipo.com. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to our distinguished moderator, Jason Putnam Gordon. Jason, take it away.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've had the pleasure to work with you since 2013, I think. And at the time it was in person, but these days it's all virtual. So as Rob mentioned, I'm the moderator today. Additionally, I'll also be running all of the items in the background. So bear with me if there's a technical issue, because I got to work through that while I'm moderating at the same time. But as Rob mentioned, I'm Jason Putnam Gordon. I'm a shareholder at Polsinelli, which is a law firm here in the United States with 900 attorneys, 25 offices. I'm in our emerging growth and venture capital group. And then I also run our health ventures group, which focuses on digital health, diagnostics, health and wellness, and devices. We've got a wonderful panel here today. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves in a moment, but we've got Jennifer Vancini, a partner at Mighty Capital, Gary Goldman, who's the managing director of Global Health Impact Fund, and Ephraim Lindenbaum, who is the managing director of Advance Ventures. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of how today's conversation is going to go. What we're going to do is we're going to have the panel speak for about an hour, leaving a half an hour at the end for Q&A. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom as opposed to the chat function. If it comes in via the Q&A function, it's easier for us to track. It'll be easier for us to answer. Today's event, as Rob has already noted and is noted in the materials, is recorded. So if you miss some or all of it, we'll be able to provide it to you afterwards. Additionally, I want to make just a note on COVID. You know, we are now 5 months, 6 months or so into this COVID scenario. It has obviously been quite detrimental to the US and to the world, but today's topic is not necessarily going to focus on that. Today, we'll be focusing on health tech. I'll let the panelists elaborate a little bit more on maybe how COVID has affected us to date and moving forward, but we're not going to be focused on the COVID situation. And as I said, I'm going to kick this off by allowing the panelists to introduce themselves. But first, I'd like to find out who we have in our audience so that we can try and tailor our conversation to who's here. So we'll start by launching a poll. All right. Who here is a first-time entrepreneur? So there's a multiple choice because maybe you fit into some of these buckets. But please let us know who's an entrepreneur, first-time serial, who's an investor, VC angel, maybe academia, maybe in the academia or the media. Who here is a legal counsel, an accountant, or someone else? And I don't believe I've allowed the panelists to vote, so you guys will just get to see the results. All right, so we'll let this go for about another 45 seconds or so, and then I'll read off the results. And then maybe we'll allow Jennifer to start and open up by saying who she is. So let's see what comes in. We've got about half the votes at this point.
Sure, thanks, Jason. Pleased to be here. I'm Jennifer Vancini. I'm a general partner with Mighty Capital. And Mighty is a Silicon Valley-based venture capital firm investing in companies at the early growth stage, so Series A, Series B. And we look for companies that have achieved some product market fit, traction, and now they're raising capital to really step up to the next level of growth. Although we invest significantly in the B2B SaaS enterprise areas, one area of our focus is precision medicine, life sciences, especially where it maybe overlaps with big data. Some of our investments in that space include Mission Bio, who's Mayfield and funded by others. Their mission is to cure cancer through single cell analysis. Fabric Genomics, who helps teams diagnose rare childhood diseases based on whole genome sequencing. Neptune Medical recently made an investment in Siren Care, which is a really interesting play, diabetic foot care, but at the base of it, they have a platform for socks that have neurofabrics woven into it, so you can detect the formation of diabetic foot ulcers before they happen, and a remote monitoring solution as well. With all of these companies, we're not talking COVID, but I've certainly seen how it's affected their business in the sector, and there's certainly a lot of promising opportunities and opportunities for business models to evolve in this sector. So that's me in a nutshell and a bit about our portfolio.
Terrific. Gary?
Sure. Hi, Gary Goldman. Happy to be here. So my background's, I started out as a dentist. I'm a physician. I'm a practicing anesthesiologist for the last 35 years, serial entrepreneur. I've had 3 companies in the digital health space over the last 30 plus years, worn pretty much every operator hat there is to wear in healthcare on the clinical and administrative side. And I am now currently the founding partner of Global Health Impact Fund and founder of the Global Health Impact Network, which is our associated clinician-driven network. I'm also a physician enterprise informatics lead for Sutter Health. So I've spent the last 9 years working and leading Sutter Health in the implementation of Epic, the electronic healthcare record for 27 hospitals, and then consulted around the country at some of the major academic institutions for their implementations. And our fund is a physician-founded, driven, and managed strategic healthcare venture capital fund and network. And we're completely focused at this point with Fund 1 on digital health investments and strategic management. And our network is a virally growing digital health clinician community, which it's built on its members and its networks, and all the clinical members are encouraged to actively participate as investors, advisors, consultants in digital health and the ongoing digital health revolution. Thanks.
Ephraim?
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it, Jason. Ephraim Lindebaum, I'm the Managing Director of Advanced Ventures, and I'm a recovering entrepreneur myself, so I've sat on the side of the table with many of you that are on the Zoom today. Spent the first third of my career building a very large company here in Silicon Valley, exited in the first .com boom, and in turn, as it is in Silicon Valley, kind of binary. You either start your next company when you exit or you become an investor. And I jokingly said I didn't have any good ideas at the time, so I had to default and become a VC. We've now invested since 1999, so we're one of the few remaining 99 vintage maiden funds out there, which either means we're gluttons for punishment or we're pretty good at what we do. We've now invested through 3 successive funds, technically investing out of our 4th fund to date. Broadly invest across the ecosystems of technology, communications, and health and wellness. As it applies to this category, we were some of the earliest health tech investors in the mid-2000s when tech and health sort of came together, both in terms of mobility and digital IT within the hospital systems. In turn, we've been really blessed to have an exit now about every 14 months throughout the history of the fund, and you can add that up over 20 years. And happy to say our most recent exit was actually in the digital health space, which is kind of a rarity. There are very few digital exits in the digital health space, and we were very lucky to exit with SnapMD to a very large PE transaction to Kinderhook Industries at the end of last year. In turn, we have a number of digital health companies ranging from diagnostics to therapeutics, all the way through animal health and the agriculture side of the digital health side. So we're very broad-based in that category and have been doing it for a long time.
Fantastic. Well, we are excited to have each of you here today. And before we get into the discussion, let's just see who's in the room. So I'm going to share the results. It looks like I think 2/3 of the folks answered. Of that, 2/3 are first-time entrepreneurs, 20% are serial. We've got about 14% angel investors, 3% VC, a few academics, and a few in the other category. Interestingly, we've got about 38% of the Bay Area. That's where I'm located. I'm in San Francisco. 25% in the US, which leaves sort of about, 60-70% elsewhere, including Europe, Asia, and Africa, and one other, which I put that category on there because I was hoping maybe someone was going to beam in from space or tune in from Antarctica. So it'll be interesting to see who that is. And finally, I put in, just trying to understand the verticals. We've got therapeutics, 2 folks, devices, 10 folks, diagnostics, 6, biologics, 1, telehealth, 9, clinical trial tech, 1, customer acquisition, 2, operations and care management, 6, prescription tech, 2, and then 18 others. So with that in mind, I'm going to open this up to the panel just to maybe carve out and provide some background information in terms of when we're talking about health tech today, what are we going to be talking about? And we'll open it up. Is there someone who'd like to go first?
Yeah. So Gary, you're the most interesting guy in the world with your background, man. So please start. I don't know.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Sure. So, I mean, we're, whether it's luck or not, as the founder of our fund 2 years ago when I started it up, my initial inclination was really to just start a venture fund that was completely driven and managed by physicians and clinicians, and all the investors are clinicians, with the idea of spending a lot of time on focusing on the input from a clinical perspective. So we're better than in digital health, right? Because it's the end users who really, at the end of the day, decide what really works and what really doesn't. So with that said, we picked digital health, and who could have ever predicted that, a horrible pandemic would be one of the biggest white clouds for a sector and investment. But digital health has really fallen into that. So we spend, a super majority of our time focusing in on telemedicine and devices, remote monitoring, and which is a place where, again, I was the one who said I didn't want to spend too much time speaking about COVID, but COVID has created a large market. And I think what it's done is it's accelerated the digital health market 5 years in about 4 months. And only because it's made much of it mandatory because of the limitations that the pandemic has provided.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Gary. I mean, I think what's interesting, and I encourage everybody to follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. We tweet every 48 hours about digital health, if not more regularly. I think a lot of the things you've talked about in terms of digital health adoption, I mean, the acceleration that we've seen there in the pandemic is huge. But I think what's most important is that we've found that right now with this pandemic, this has become the biggest opportunity in digital health as we've seen. Number one, we've got this adoption curve that is being very quickly advanced. Number two, the pandemic has exposed tremendous holes within the entire health value chain. I mean, ranging from the very onset all the way through the payment side of the equation. And this has created some of the greatest greenfields out there. From our standpoint, many categories that no one has ever looked at before have really popped up as incredible pain points. Now, that being said, health tech beyond the supply chain pandemic at this point to us has become very challenging. We are very reticent to invest beyond this category. Therapeutics are jammed up. I just had a great conversation. I was telling Jason yesterday with a good friend of mine at a very large health tech fund, or very large fund at all. Great, phase 3 cancer therapeutic. It's going to save thousands and thousands of lives every year. They have effectively jammed up for the next 24 months. I mean, while we get EUAs for low-grade qPCR tests that, grad students can essentially push out the door getting approved for EUA, therapeutics like that, there's a mountain of those that make huge, huge impacts, are just completely jammed up. So, FDA is a mess. Even getting through a 510 right now is very challenging. I think one of the advice that we've tended to have, around this category for entrepreneurs for a while has been, one, find a real business, where people and or payers are quickly able to bring you to the table, right? Number two, today, if you can find a way to pivot into something that is related to the challenges in the healthcare system, That's very, very interesting. And then the third piece, and this stands for venture as a whole, but nice to have versus must have has become a very critical question within the health tech healthcare system, right? Many, we often find, the 50th telehealth deal focused on the 100th different vertical today. Unless there's a must have there, the amount of, mind share you're going to get through a hospital system, a payer network, etc., is really key. So I think those are important factors. And I'd love to hear more from our panelists on areas that they're seeing, which is this incredible white space in the category.
Yeah, I guess I can pick up the thread there. A couple things to pick up on, launching from where you guys started. We're certainly seeing that necessity is breeding invention, right? So it has exposed the gaps and the holes. We're seeing that there are opportunities to disrupt, change business models. For example, I mentioned Siren Care. When they started out, they thought they had to hire a bunch of salespeople to go knock on podiatrist doors. Well, they're not taking appointments. So they can put their salespeople anywhere and cover a huge territory now much more efficiently without having to do those in-person doctor's offices. And many people outside of the COVID sector, healthcare took a bit of an economic hit as well for what was unnecessary, what had to be put on hold. And people across the system are looking for supplemental ways to build their revenue. So they're looking for new revenue streams as their businesses got disrupted. So we're seeing some of that. Also, any solution that helps get rid of inefficiency, keep the costs controlled, facilitate communication is really grabbing hold in an industry that was maybe a little slow to change around these things. It reminds me a lot of the educational market, where suddenly people that didn't have to think like a startup have to think like a startup, and how they can very quickly respond, pivot, do things differently, and open their minds a little bit, cut through some bureaucracy to serve a very immediate need. So there are certainly opportunities there. To the point that was raised, though, other areas are definitely hitting a log jam because COVID has monopolized so much of the resources and the process of getting a product to market. So I think, yeah, clarity. Mining Capital's an exclusive sponsored products account. We're very focused on the best products. We think the best products win. Notice I didn't say technology. We think the best products win. And that's especially true in these sorts of markets where it's a big challenge and companies have to be resilient and really have to have something that's sticky that the customer must have today. I had a whole lot in there to cover, both the points you guys started raising. Maybe you want to riff from there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to riff it from there. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we've always seen in the digital health category right now has been, not only just the broad-based adoption curve, but really the economic curve. The sales cycle into these systems have been, 6 months or 8 or 9 months would be like breakneck speed. Okay. We've seen 18, 24, 36 months. I mean, to be frank with you, before the pandemic, a lot of digital health investors had really sort of picked up their, tools and were headed home. Therapeutics, different story, different type of investor, different check sizes, really a different story. That's not for the faint of heart. That's for the billion-dollar funds for the most part on the therapeutic side. But digital health, has left a trail of wreckage, both through the investment community and as well through the hospital side. So many, nifty, great, very cool products have tried to make it in. They couldn't get adoption, couldn't get any revenue. I mean, arguably we had one of the top 3 telehealth companies, out there, right? And, I can't tell you how challenging it was. We looked at merging with Livongo. We looked at, doing all kinds of teledoc. We were powering half of the little startups out there used by every major hospital, and, getting paid was pulling teeth. And, we had like arguably one of the key wins, before some of the big mergers by just selling this, getting out, if you will, on the venture side to a big telehealth, PE company, big private equity firm. So, I think what's important to, entrepreneurs is really understanding the ability to get paid in digital health. I mean, that is the #1 story out there. And, if the word payer doesn't come out of your mouth in your elevator pitch and who the payer is going to be, you got to go back and you got to learn the industry, because, you know, consumers do not pay for product, unfortunately, here. Whereas, you know, the healthcare system and the payer systems that are out there, there are very challenging, but once in the door, very effective ways to get paid on a regular basis.
Yeah,
And forget Medicare.
Yeah, so I'm going to chime in and take us back a step in that this is all true. And part of the problem is, and how do we avoid the Theranos investments of the world and digital health, right? You know, we've blown up a lot of money in digital health. And the reason is that, you know, many of the entrepreneurs, many of the idea generators were not necessarily clinicians, nor did they have access to those clinicians that would be using this technology. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you can pick a lot of different sectors. You can look at telemedicine. You know, we've spent a lot of time looking at telemedicine. Our network, which has, you know, thousands of clinicians involved in it, have been forced to use telemedicine. So great. I know a bunch of telemedicine companies, and yes, they uploaded 10,000 new providers in a very short period of time. Why? Because they didn't have a choice. They had to use telemedicine. It would have taken 5 years to accomplish that.
Yeah.
But now we're at a point when you look at it from a venture capital perspective. So should we be out there like throwing all our money into all these telemedicine companies? Absolutely not. Because at the end of the day, all telemedicine is Zoom between a patient and a provider right now. I call it telemedicine 1.0. It's like Epic 1.0 15 years ago, right? It was a disaster. It added nothing but inefficiencies to care. It increased the cost of care. My wife was spending 6 hours more in the office every day just dealing with the electronic healthcare record. It was the whole impetus in which we started our venture fund in our network, is that unless the clinicians, the people in the trenches using these tools, are actively involved in the development of these tools and the commercialization of these tools, good luck trying to get it into a hospital system, because they may not be the decision makers, but I guarantee you there are a lot of hospital systems that put a lot of money into solutions that are now in the garbage pail because the clinician said, this is ridiculous. I wouldn't use this. So the model that we use with our venture fund is you got to get past the clinicians before you can even get to the finance people. So we bring in, you know, we've got investments in our fund. I'll give examples. We have one that's a remote monitoring device for physical therapy and orthopedics. Well, when I walked in the door of that, and you know, it's almost, I almost feel like I could charge admission to some of my principal partners because I know exactly how the calls are going to go. And I bring in a bunch of orthopedic surgeons and a bunch of physical therapists and a bunch of chiropractors. We have all of this in our network. And I warn the founder and I say, look, you're about to give a presentation. Do not give your typical pitch presentation. These are a bunch of clinicians. Convince them why they should be using their product. That's number one. Number two is, you know, you brought up a very valid point, Ephraim, is that, you know, it's the revenue cycle part of it. You can have the best idea in the world. You go try selling that to a doctor's office or an enterprise if they can't collect for it. Unless it's an oncology solution that's going to save 1 million lives, forget about it. It may look nice, it may sound great, but if you can't, if it adds less efficiency to your workflow, it takes more time, and it maybe solves a small problem, no one's going to buy that, and the doctors are not going to approve it. I mean, a perfect example of that, and I could rant on, as you can tell, for hours about this. You know, a perfect example of that is, you know, you bring it in front of the clinicians, and here's a good example with, again, I'm an informaticist for a 27 hospital system. I can't tell you how many failures we've had about implementing solutions that are supposed to sit on top of electronic healthcare record. The first question I always ask is, does this integrate into the EHR? And you always get, oh yeah, absolutely. And then I'm like, well, actually tell me what does that really mean? Because then you get the orthopedic surgeons in front of that example I was going to give you, and they built a great workflow specialty specific platform, but it wasn't integrated into the electronic healthcare record. And I watched it unfold. The orthopedic surgeon, who's an investor in my fund, says, let me tell you something. Let me tell you what my day's like. I see 50 patients in a day. I have 7 minutes to 10 minutes with a patient. If I have to go out of the electronic healthcare record to a portal, to your website to give me a bunch of data, which I have no idea what to do with because I've never looked at this data before, I'm not going to buy your product. And you would laugh. And again, I can say this as a clinician, and it shouldn't take away. And I know there's one orthopedic surgeon in the audience who I know who's going to laugh at this. The orthopedic surgeon said, I want red light, green light, yellow light. Tell me if my patient is complying with their physical therapy and they're making progress. If you can't tell me that in the electronic healthcare record, just throw it in the garbage pail right now. And the next part was, am I getting paid for this? So thank God of the pandemic, because now all of a sudden remote monitoring is compensated in this new world, at least for the moment. So there's a reason for them to add this level of efficiency and a level of ability to track patients, because now it does improve care, but it also, they get paid for doing it. So they can spend an hour looking at data at the end of the day for all their patients, and they're compensated for it. So I'll stop there, because as I said, I could go on and on about this.
Yeah, certainly one of the things we look at, a major commercial milestone for a startup is, does it have a reimbursement code? Is it reimbursable? That's a big milestone if it's the kind of solution that touches a patient, of course. That adds to your valuation, will help you raise money. That's a huge traction point and something you need to think about from day one, in addition to if it's FDA. But I think more importantly, what can it be reimbursed and for how much? Reliably is a big issue. Also, to your point about usability and products, I usually will advise a company to get a nurse on their advisory board, because no matter how great everybody says it is, if it's in the clinician's environment and the nurse is somehow touching it, if he or she is not on board with it, it's never going to get used, and your traction's going to go right. So it's got to be in the hands of the people that are actually going to use it to validate that it's the product that they need and that they'll actually use long term.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I will say I love what Gary's talking about in terms of, having that feedback loop from clinicians. Although I will say, do not have clinicians on your management team. Practicing medicine, no offense, Gary, practicing medicine and practicing startups are best left separate. Getting advice and counsel from clinicians is great. And I totally agree with Jennifer that, don't get it from the orthopedic surgeon, get it from that person's nurse, because honestly, the nurse is going to do 99% of the stuff and then hand it to a physician. I have, sadly, and I won't name names, but have had a situation where the absolute highest tech piece of technology was in the hands of the smartest brain surgeon in the world with a family member. And at the end of the day, a virtual walk through the brain does not equal a great outcome. So, it isn't a panacea, number one. And number two, like Jennifer said, get the nurse, don't get the doctor, because at the end of the day, the doctor's going to give you 10 minutes. Cause like Gary said, they're going to ask who's paying them, because that's how it works. If you carry that much debt from med school, you'd ask too. So it's really like the cab drivers of the service industry, right? So, that's how it is.
But, it's a great point. It actually leads to another subsector in healthcare, which is really a very hot spot. And I will tell you right now that I really don't like the AI word, because when you put artificial in front of anything, I can tell you the first chance that you want to turn a clinician off, tell them that they're going to be replaced by some technology.
Oh, I got a great story. Wait, Gary, you're gonna love this. You're gonna love this. So in the food and agriculture industry, we're a very large investor in consumer packaged good and so on. The word artificial in front of a sweetener today is you couldn't even get a product that's been on the store shelves for years to be sold today, let alone a new product in the market. Think of it that way. A clinician's gonna look at the same word. If the word artificial is in front of pretty much anything, right? It doesn't work. And, it's funny, but, we've even seen, I'm not going to name names, but back in the mid 2000s, one of the first couple of 5 waves of AI, I mean, we had an exit in AI in 2003, right? This is like the fourth coming of AI. And, they had this great tech that was reading radiology and was supposed to, essentially, find tumors. And it probably would have been great until radiologists basically rose up and blocked them so fully and completely that great company that took $100 million, which was like 2x today, was decimated, right? They wouldn't get one check from one clinic in the entire world once the radiologists are there. It makes, any workers union look wimpy when clinicians are involved,
But on the other side of it, the point that I was going to make is that, so I gave the telemedicine example, right? So telemedicine 1.0, great. Okay, it's a video connection. But at the end of the day, my wife goes into the bedroom. She's a maternal fetal medicine doc, right? Probably one of the subspecialties that least lends itself to telemedicine when you have a mother and a baby and you have to monitor it. But it's still doable. And actually, we have a great investment in that area. But I have to set her up with 3 computers in the dining room, and then she has to make that work with a patient who has very much can't even make the computer work. So, I mean, the level of efficiency for telemedicine is crazy. But if we really, seriously look at it and say, well, what is the clinician? The most important part of telemedicine is that connection between the clinician and the patient, right? And how do we make it in a way where it's not just the EHR and it's not just the video connection or the asynchronous communication connection between the provider, but it also includes AI and decision support and machine learning around revenue cycle, around workflow. It's a workflow specialty specific solution. Why would you ask an orthopedic surgeon to use the same solution that a cardiologist is using?
Well,
and that's what they're doing right now.
Yeah, it's super interesting you're mentioning that, Gary, but a lot of that comes down to the fact that there actually are 3 or 4 really top tier telehealth platforms out there. We've been investors since 2015 in the space. The problem is everybody try and reinvents the wheel without all of those pieces, right? Where, so for example, our folks, which aren't our folks anymore because they've been acquired now, right? But it was Cleveland Clinic, Mount Sinai, MD, those were the people that built their platform. They go all the way from, remote monitoring of uploading IoT data from, a pediatric patient in Wyoming with an insulin or a chemo pump. They get that data in there. They have the billing codes, it auto builds, their virtual waiting rooms, virtual scheduling, automated thing. Like they built, there are some sort of, Outlook's great platforms of the world. The problem is every little vertical play. I mean, a dermatology deal came to us the other day and they're building their own telehealth platform. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, you want to build, I mean, it's like we're gonna build a new iOS operating system because we've got an app that like lets you clap after like, songs or something. I mean, it's like insane.
So
it's like, what did Apple do,
That's so important because, again, you look at our model, right? To me, the venture fund that we have, and it's a small cap venture fund, it's all clinician investors, but it's only a small part of what we're building. We built on the other side of it, a whole clinician driven network, right? And we have communities that we're building around every specialty, right? So we have a telemedicine initiative, and you're right, there's so many different companies working on, I have a whiteboard that's 10 by 10 and there's 150 circles on it. And each one of them represents a different founder with a different startup. Now that's EHR 2.0 all over again. Okay. Interoperability nightmare. So the whole focus of our fund is that when we make investments as clinicians, we look at the investment not as an isolated investment, but more as a synergistic environment, which is our network, right? So if I'm going to invest in a bunch of remote monitoring and I'm going to invest in a couple of workflow specialty specific solutions, what we're trying to do is be the agnostic environment that now can foster the collaboration of all of that in a single platform, so that when you go to either a practice or you go to an enterprise or an HCO, you can say, okay, well, what specialties are you working in? I have cardiology, I have orthopedics, I have PM&R, I have all of these areas. Well, you build it out so it's modules, but you're right, it has to be one platform. If it's 27 different platforms, that's a disaster waiting to happen. And you're right, only some of the big players are starting to look at that. I mean, the acquisition of Livongo for $1.8 million by Teladoc, smart idea because, right, I know Livongo. And they're doing the right thing, and they can bring that kind of chronic care, specialty specific approach to what Teladoc was already building, which was not that. So it makes sense. So the sector is pushing in that way, but you know what? Where EHRs were 10 years ago in telemedicine. And unless we, as the investors and the advisors and the strategic partners of these organizations, start forcing them to accelerate that process in a way where it benefits you and I as a patient and a provider, it's going to be a disaster all over again. So that's why the venture capital part is so important, because we can kind of guide those companies in the right direction, learning, what's it called, you know, in healthcare, the biggest, and the word, the word that we use so often, or the phrase that we use so often now in the last 10 years is lessons learned, right? That's the big term right now. And we're so bad as an industry to use lessons learned on the financial side and the tech and innovation side that we have to start incorporating that. Exactly. We have to start incorporating that into, as digital health revolution expands, we have to control it so that we use our lessons learned from mistakes like EHRs.
Yeah, sorry, Jennifer, please. We've kind of locked you out for a while. Apologies on that
Oh, it's
one.
interesting. Yeah, telemedicine is a very hot area to talk about. And I think you're right, Gary. It's like EHR, super fragmented, a million players. At the end of the day, it's going to be an oligopoly, if not a monopoly, right? So there's going to be one or two that emerge, and maybe there will be roll-ups and consolidation along the way. But everybody who thinks they have an idea in that better understand that sector dynamic, right? Or it's going to be a really expensive, frustrating road to get there. So.
Yeah,
What other
as
technologies?
far as-
You know, we talked about AI, and I see some skepticism on the chat on AI, which I would actually disagree with. I think it really depends on, is it the right product? Was the product built right? What is it being used for? It can be difficult as an investor to tease apart what's underneath. It's like encryption. How do you know it works, right? What are the algorithms? How do you know the data is the best? And it's only through repeated evidence and traction and results that you see that it actually is an effective product. And, you know, one of my favorite case studies there is Fabric Genomics, who does whole genome sequencing, looking for variants, something that can be very manual if you don't automate it. They got a Guinness World Record working with Rady Children's Hospital to take a pediatric rare disease diagnostic process down from 6 weeks to less than a day. So that's impactful, and that makes the physicians happy without replacing them, because they're actually able to help these children. It's a godsend for the families as well, right? So there are definitely places where it works, but I like it within a product that's doing something meaningful, not AI as a platform. That's very hard to sell. It's very hard to plug into anything. It's never it's never zero touch, right? AI on its own is not a product, it's algorithms, right? So it depends how it's built. And no, it can't always predict everything. Did it predict a pandemic? You didn't need AI to predict a pandemic. We knew we were going to have one. You don't need one to tell you the Hayward fault's going to go someday either. But, you know, we're not going to sit and say no one predicted that.
Yeah,
the machine.
I've got a great, Jennifer, I got a great joke that follows your line with the AI thing. You know, and this follows Gary's as well, which is really the issue is this: clinicians don't believe anybody else is as intelligent as them. Therefore, the word artificial intelligence can never interact with them directly. So that's really how it works, right? And so from my standpoint, and please don't take it that way, I think AI all across the health system is super important. It's amazing. And there are ways that we're starting to see things, even data entry, using AI to speed that up. I mean, look, even decision makings, in some of the most advanced surgeons in the world at Stanford, particularly in 12-hour surgeries, are using AI all across the space. I mean, if you're, a brain or heart cardiothoracic surgeon on a 12-hour surgery, you could be wearing a flight suit, okay, like a fighter pilot wears. So, and I'm not kidding. I mean, I have friends that do that, and to them, if you had a little AI that made sure that warm juice was always warm and juicy for you, hey, they're all in. I mean, if it's like, making sure the ECMO machine is like well thought through, any of those pieces are really welcomed, right? I do think in radiology, honestly, and in some of the imaging sciences, although there is an art to the science, having an AI backstory is super important, because you know what? Human beings get tired. Human beings get busy. Human beings, family calls them when they're doing something and things slip by, right? So I'm a huge fan of AI across it. And it's just, it's like it's the must-have versus nice-to-have dynamic. The one thing we haven't talked about is IoT. I mean, I can't tell you, from like 2013 until like earlier this morning, I have seen an IoT device of the day that applies to the healthcare industry. What I haven't seen is any of them, well, a few, but some that have actually been meaningful, but most, have just been so challenging. And maybe I'd love to get both your Jennifer and your Gary, feedback on IoT and health tech.
I think the perfect example is this little device right here, right? So you look at that, and so one of the investments that we made early on, it was actually our first investment, is a company in the South Bay, SensaFree, who's developed a technology to monitor beat-to-beat blood pressures as accurate as an arterial line. Okay, but when I looked at the company, and again, as an anesthesiologist, this is what I do day in, day out, every second of the day, right? So, but when you have very, very sick patients who are very complex, we put in a thing called an arterial line, right? Goes into an artery.
Yeah.
And it's a procedure that has a lot of morbidity if it's not done correctly. Now, if you can avoid doing that by developing a technology that's just an EKG patch over that same artery and using a technology to be able to collect that same information from beat to beat, great, right? But the key is, and again, so we talk about the iWatch, right? And detection of atrial fibrillation. You want to talk about a nightmare. And so, first of all, that is not an insignificant disease to be detected, okay? And when you detect it, the implications are very significant. So the last thing that we want is a technology that hasn't been proven from a medical grade perspective to then be released into the commercial environment to the consumer, where now my watch says, okay, we think you had an episode of atrial fibrillation, and so now what's going to happen now? So now we're going to send a note to your cardiologist, right? And we're going to tell them that you had an episode of AFib, and you can, the whole medical cascade of what comes from that is very significant. So for me, when you talk about IoT, and again, I always, as a clinician, as a VC in the clinician space, you have to separate out consumer versus medical grade. And if you take a company, and if they're not looking to prove it in the medical grade space first, I run in the opposite direction, because it's a potential disaster. Can it work? Absolutely. And if it does, it would be a great investment. But if you can prove something in an ICU that works, and something that works in the operating room, and then you want to take it and invest it in a watch that the average individual is going to wear to detect blood pressure, and we can go on and on about how that would radically change the management of blood pressure if you had a device that could do that, great. So in that deal that we did, of course, one of the reasons I went into the deal was because they were going medical grade, but I also see that if I had a watch that told me my blood pressure, I want Apple and Samsung to be as part of that deal. So Samsung was part of that deal, Samsung Ventures, right? So it addresses both the commercial market on the consumer side and on the medical grade side of it. So for me with IoT, when you bring that up, I'm really focused on, tell me about the idea, what solution does it solve? And also, it brings up the idea of data analytics, especially with IoT, right? So you look at SensaFree. SensaFree is now collecting data. So if all of a sudden I had my blood pressure, I'm hypertensive. So now my watch is telling me that when I'm yelling at my 20-year-old son because he did something that I didn't like, my watch now tells me that my blood pressure just went up. And Gary, go in your office, sit down and meditate for a while using your digital therapeutic meditation app that you have on your watch. That is something that makes sense, right? But as one very, very smart biotech VC said to me, you have to be very careful about data because it's garbage in, garbage out. So unless you know the data that you're getting, the algorithms that are using to evaluate that data, and then the responses on the decision support side of it that come out of that technology, it could be a great idea or it could be worthless. So to me, I've spent a lot of time, I've educated myself in the last 2-3 years on data analytics. And there are so many companies now as a VC, when we go in and do our due diligence, they'll tell me that they're either a remote monitoring company or they're a technology platform. But what I see is a much larger data analytics company, because now they're collecting data that's never been collected before. And from a healthcare perspective, with that data, how we can change outcomes in care with digital therapeutics is much more valuable than just collecting the data. So that's the other part of IoT for me, that really is important.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, there have been some huge wins. I mean, if you look at the diabetic monitoring category,
Yeah.
you know, that's been game changing. My 85-year-old father uses a Dexcom 6. I mean, you know, doesn't have to prick his finger. I mean, that's game changing. I mean, some of the stuff we're seeing today in pulse oximetry, very, very interesting stuff. I mean, what Massimo has done. Now, that's a place actually where AI works, because Massimo is like this great new device that goes into the patient's rooms. It started in the ICUs. You know, they've even can extend it into home monitoring. The thing is amazing. Setting it up requires the one charge nurse or ICU nurse who actually has an IT degree. So that's where AI to set things up somehow didn't make it into the food chain, but there is some great tech out there. I mean, and to Gary's point, yeah, I mean, this whole concept of kind of half-baked tech is very, very challenging out there. I mean, we recently saw, a thumb-based defibrillator. I don't know if you saw this one, Gary. This thing is like the size of a cell phone. You hold it between your fingers like a video game controller, and it's a defibrillator. The last thing in the world I want would be people at home deciding to play, let's use a defibrillator, okay? I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, imagine that with the shock ratio that will turn a squirrel into a barbecue. I mean, this thing is, I mean, there are some really weird things. If this was an auto part, this would only be allowed for professionals, right? I mean, but meanwhile, you can do your own home surgery. So, I think there are a lot of areas that make sense. And then, to Jennifer's point earlier, who's going to pay for it, right? I get it if it's an app on Apple and that's all lovely. We're all cool. Hey, man, if you get some adoption curve, but then you got to come up with a business model. And that, if we want to take a quick, parse into that category here, I mean, digital health has got some of the most complex yet some of the most binary business models in any category. So I'm just pulling the grenade and throwing it out into the room here, and let's see where it lands.
So, I mean, are you seeing that basically in order to sort of escape the issue of being able, and avoid the reimbursement issue, folks are kind of trying to pivot into the consumer space as opposed to the clinical space? And if I can just sort of unpack sort of some of this conversation, because some of the folks here are first-time entrepreneurs, that's potentially problematic, right? Because at the end of the day, you're looking for something that's going to measurably increase somebody's health and wellness. Is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, as investors, we're looking for a return on the investment.
Right.
Okay, so, and a lot of the health IoT stuff has started and migrated into the consumer space. It can be debatable if some of this stuff really increases wellness. If people think it does, I guess it does, but sometimes it's just fun and a toy. But one of the challenges with consumer-based products is when you look at the exits in it, and they're kind of trapped between a consumer product and medical grade. So when you look at how much it can grow the revenue, what it's going to cost to build a consumer brand and get distribution for these things, and the incredible amount of competition in the space as well, we have to look very carefully at whether or not it's going to return the right return.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Gary, please.
No, go ahead, go.
Yeah, so to me, there's a top of the stack moment that exists, right? To Jason's point early on, it's just they're left brain and there's right brain. There is private pay and non-private pay. Everything else lives under that umbrella, right? Whether it's a consumer, whether it's a clinician's office, whether it's a surgery center, a hospital, whatever, it's private versus non-private, right? And then under private, there's patient pay, there's whether it's procedural pays, and then on the other side, it's really billing code. And then is it insurance? Is it Medicare? Who runs in that stack? So, if you don't get that, whenever, and, we encourage it right now, you wouldn't, start, very many things in life without having a reasonable understanding of how those things work, right? You don't get on, one of those powered skateboards without, ideally having been able to stand up on it, right? You don't go, swimming with sharks if you can't really swim very well. So if you don't start your whole thought on the health tech side with who's going to pay for this, right? then it doesn't really matter. Because if no one's going to pay for it, it could be the greatest thing in the world and it's never going to go anywhere.
And that's a fundamental, concern, a fundamental issue for any startup or any emerging growth company, right? I mean, this is just fundamental,
Totally.
basic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeremy, I think what you got to be able to do is look at your total addressable market, right? You know, the bottom line is that the healthcare market's a huge market. Whether you focus in on the medical grade side of it or whether you focus in on the consumer side of it, it's a huge market, right? So you have to look at the product. First of all, what are you trying to accomplish here, right? If it's something that you're trying to accomplish, that does it make that much of a difference if I use this or not? You know, it's under the old joke, it couldn't hurt, category, where if I use this, what's the worst that could happen if it misdiagnoses or it doesn't really achieve what it's supposed to? So there's a lot of technology out there where if you look at the market, and I learned this lesson a long, long time ago, way before the internet even existed, okay? I looked at a business. I have 2 years of acupuncture training on top of everything else, which I never talked about. But
You are the most interesting man in the world, Barry.
so I started looking at a chain of complementary medicine clinics, right? And think about this, okay? And again, I know all sides of the fence. Most of us, every one of us, okay, who are in that middle to high income category or even lower middle. You go to the doctor, right? And you're going for your cardiologist or you're going to your anesthesiologist who's out of network for your rhinoplasty or whatever it is. And you get your bill and you complain about your $10 copay. When the bill is $4,000 and 90% of it or 80% of it is covered and you're complaining about the copay. But then every one of those patients walks out of the doctor's office, down the block, and pays $100 for a massage, okay? Or pays $75 to have their nails done or whatever it is, right? So the market is huge. The money is there. You just have to be able to identify as a VC, like Jennifer said, you have to identify the product. Is this a commercially marketable product that has an addressable market that people will buy? And, again, I've spent a lot of time, you as an entrepreneur, you have to know your product and you have to go out there and do the research. And if you develop a great idea and you don't go out and look at your total addressable market and then start doing some research and asking people, would you use this? How much would you pay for it? And determine those things before you even get out the door commercially, you're dead in the water, right? But if you know your market, people have made millions, billions of dollars on garbage because people buy into it. And it depends on your market too, right? The American market's different than the Asian market. They'll buy anything that'll improve your health, okay, in some of those markets, proven or not, because it sounds like a good idea. Because, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? I lay out $10, it doesn't work. But I tried. But if it does work, great. Why does it work? No idea, but it worked. So, and it's hard to say that as a clinician, but it's reality. In healthcare too, there are a lot of things that we do that work, but we don't know why they work, okay? But we've done scientific evidence-based studies to look at it and look at what's called outcome studies. And that's what you were referring to, F, right? Is that you gotta look at the outcome studies, right? So and it takes such large populations of patients to look at outcome. It's not something that any one company is gonna do with a 510K, study of 15 patients, right? And if you look at pharmaceuticals, I mean, how many times have they put a drug out that they did phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, and 2 years later we find out that, Voltaren is putting, half the population into renal failure because there's no way they could have identified it early on. So, and it's the same with digital health or any health innovation. Even when you release it, you have to be able to track it and do the outcome studies post commercialization to see what effects it have because, there's so many different variables.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree. I mean, look, just navigating through that process. I mean, for example, unless it's a 510 product, we really don't look at it. I mean, we've got one of our companies that was in ag and food, food tech pathogen detection technology that was doing phenomenally in that space. They had great human diagnostic team. They pivoted into healthcare. They pivoted into COVID. They actually have the highest scale COVID testing device with the highest accuracy in the market in the world, by the way, which the US government is giving them $1 million a week in grants to not put it in the market. They're in Operation Warp Speed. They can test, get this, the government has paid them to, quote, scale up their tech beyond what it was already. They can test 4,000 samples per run, which means that one machine can do up to 20,000 samples a day in terms of COVID testing. And that's one set of machines. That means a typical lab like LabCorp could do hundreds of thousands of samples a day. And it's languishing because the federal government has a problem releasing something that has 99% specificity and incredible high throughput and an $8 a unit test into the system right now. So, surprisingly, it looks like the military is going to buy it all day long, because if you're on an aircraft carrier, they want to know if you've got COVID, right? If you're in a public school in Chicago, they don't. So, it's really, really interesting what's happening out there right now.
Or maybe Amazon will, right? Amazon wants to have the first completely vaccinated supply chain, right?
Well, so they're talking to Amazon. They're talking to
Yeah.
Amazon, although Amazon's never pretty much paid for anything. They are the constant, come talk to us so we know how to build what you've done, right?
You don't want to get bought by Amazon typically. You do not want to be acquired by Amazon.
Right, exactly. Right. Yes, because mostly it's like in the Amazon, you end up being like, sort of very snake-like approach to that whole thing. So yeah, I mean, but what they're doing in healthcare and what CVS has done with Aetna, there's all kinds of really cool stuff out there, and I just want to make sure, because I know Rob's going to ding us in like 3 minutes to move into the next phase here. The one thing I do want to say, entrepreneurs, is you're hearing a lot of weird negativity from us. Just remember, we've been in the hot seat with you as, sort of partners in your journey as an entrepreneur in the digital health space, meaning, we've set, written checks, we've backed you, we're responsible to people as well, and have sat there while this has taken a long time. So what we're doing is sharing a lot of war stories that we've had. It should never deter you from going here. Like I said earlier on, this is the absolute best time in the history of, human health to do something in the space. There's so many opportunities out there. There's so many great stuff out there that could be solved by this, that, please don't let us deter you. What we want to do is make you a little better, smarter, faster than people have been in the past. And if we can do that. The other thing I'll say is, there are more incubators, accelerators, programs all across the country and the world right now, so that you're not alone. This is the greatest time as an entrepreneur to do this. Just pretty much every major city or geographic area has a health tech incubator. You'll find groups of physicians that are investors like Gary there. This is an amazing time. 10 or 15 years ago, you were on your own. You found some buddy of yours that had a surgery center and he gave you 250 grand, and you tried to climb the mountain. And, a lot of people ended up like the Donner Party, which is a local relevant thing, but I'll let Jason explain that to everybody.
That was fantastic. So here's what we're going to do. We're actually this is a wonderful, very lively panel. Thank you all very much. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift to Q&A in a second. But before we do, I want to have each of the panelists have one last moment and ability to comment sort of on what they see in health tech. It's an open-ended question and the best way to get in touch with the panelist. So we'll start with you, Gary, because you're below me, and then we'll go to Jennifer and then to F.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, again, I repeat it over and over. My focus, either from an investor perspective or from an entrepreneur perspective, again, done it 3 times, is that as you develop idea generation and then take it through the phases, the ecosystem of acceleration and then commercialization, make sure, really spend a lot of time picking the right partners. They have to be strategic partners. There's plenty of money out there that is not strategic. And then there's money out there that is strategic. And then leverage your network or leverage your investors or strategic partners networks, especially in healthcare. It's probably more important in healthcare than anywhere else, because in order to succeed from a business perspective in the healthcare space, you really need to have the right partners to get you through those doors. The foot in the door is the hardest part, and the sales cycles are long. We are at an unprecedented time. If you're working on ideas that address real problems in real time, that's the best place to start in healthcare, because there's always a lot of attention put on that. So that's what I would say. Now, to reach us, you can always reach myself or my partners at Global Health Impact Fund is one website. Global Health Impact Network is another site. It's both a mouthful. You can reach me at Gary at either one. It's fund.com, network.net.
And who are the best folks to be contacting you, or
they can reach out directly to me. You know, again, we're very clinician driven, so reach out to us, and then we and we're interested on partnering with people both on the fund side and on the network. Even if we don't invest in a company, we're happy to bring them into the network and treat them as if we were an accelerator to help them, develop their solution.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just adding to that, I think know the ecosystem you're playing in. And every company has an ecosystem, and that's your partners, your advisors, your venture capitalists, your team, the US government. And it's either strategically planned or it's built ad hoc. You're going to be much more successful if you strategically think about that ecosystem you're building from day one. Also reiterate, we highlighted a lot of the difficulties and challenges in the space, which we hope is useful to help you educate yourselves. But there are enormous opportunities. We're at almost 20% of the GDP is tied to healthcare. It may only get worse or better, depending on how you look at it, in a highly fragmented market. I'll just add one little tip that I've seen to make it easier. As companies are working on their product market fit, this is the first thing you really want to focus on. Good places to go to try it out, depending on your network, are outside of the US healthcare system, because they're often more simple, more vertically integrated, less bureaucratic. Not that they're easy, but we see Australia, UK, Canada, China, Germany, anywhere but here. And then you can make that your test market and then go bigger time for launch in the US. Just a suggestion if it's something you're able to do. In terms of getting in touch with us, we typically look at Series A, sometimes late seed deals. You can email your pitch deck to dealflow@mightycapital.com. Sorry, let me make sure that's right. I think it might be dealflow@mighty.capital, dealflow@mighty.capital. Feel free to link in with me as well, but if you really want your pitch deck to, for sure, get due attention, and I try to when I get the cold emails, but don't always get to them. But we have a really clear process for vetting opportunities that come in and welcome cold outreach. So that's it for me. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did a lot of talking. I'm going to make this super short here. So first, this is, again, the greatest time in the history of human health to be in this space. There's so much money on the sidelines. The venture capitalists were all topped off our tank. Tons of capital is getting deployed. Companies are getting bought. The few bits of caution, just to tail in, because certainly Jennifer and Gary have added a lot there. Don't get lulled into believing because everything's selling right now that's going to happen after COVID. It's an order taking time in digital health versus an actual selling time. And that's really important. And then, in terms of getting in touch, I'd love to tell you that we're easy to get in touch with, but, and I want to talk to all of you. But just not going to happen. So the things that I'm going to tell you to do is LinkedIn. If I don't get back to you, I apologize. It might be not because it's a fit. The best thing you can do is hire a great counsel like Jason, who is going to then in turn introduce you to someone like us, because he is the human filter. He is the AI that says, is this company worthy of going to investors, right? And, we rely on people like him to, in essence, screen the deal flow for us to make sure you're not a crazy, that it's not something that would not make sense, because, he has a reputation with us. He wants to always be, someone who brings us great deals. So service providers, great counsels like that, great place to start. Honestly, unsolicited deal flow doesn't get a lot of traction. If, go get some early money from Gary. Gary will, come to people like Jennifer and myself. In today's COVID environment, we are doing very few fresh deals, which mean almost every deal is coming from a trusted provider. Most likely a round has been done by one of our colleagues or, trusted other venture investors, angels, accelerators, et cetera, who can give us the breakdown so that we don't, because we don't have the time with the entrepreneur. So keep those things in mind. Those are all things should work in your roadmap as a business, as you kind of approach us.
Well, thank you very much, F. We didn't even work that out ahead of time, but I really appreciate it.
I'll tell you where to send the check, Gary. Just don't worry about that. It's in the chat stream.
That's fantastic. All right, so we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A, 25 minutes or so. We'll start off with a softball for Jennifer, which is someone's requesting the name of the diabetic foot care company that you mentioned at your intro.
Yeah, they're really a neurofabrics platform company with a remote monitoring solution that chose this market first because it is so massive. They're called Siren Care, SIRENCARE. And they achieved that Medicare reimbursement milestone, and it's incredible what it's done for their business. So.
Terrific. All right, this one might be most apt to be answered by Gary, at least to start there. Are you seeing startups or any other companies fostering adoption of traditional medicine globally, like Chinese medicine, or is that still an untapped opportunity? And I only ask you because you mentioned, I didn't know this before today's conversation, that you spent 2 years training as an acupuncturist.
So, and again, we can call it either the alternative or complementary medicine market. And yes, we've actually looked at a number of investments in that space. The difficulty in that sector is that particular patient population and clinician population tends to be very much a face-to-face population that really wants to be taken care of at the point, not at the point of care, but they want to be taken care of in that kind of setting, a wellness setting. But with that said, there's one in particular, it's called HELPSEY, HELPSEY. And it was actually started by a oncology nurse from UCSF who was very focused on the complementary medicine aspect of oncology care. We came so close to investing in that company. And the only reason we really didn't is that one of our advisors happens to be very high up in technology at Dell. And he looked at the platform, and his concern is they were almost on the border when we talk about decision support, about diagnosing and treating. And at this stage, there is a lot of liability that goes with that. I didn't necessarily agree with that statement, and I really liked the platform. So yes, there are companies out there in that space, and I think it's a huge sub-vertical market with a very big total addressable market, as I mentioned. And that's a space where I think consumers are willing to spend the mighty dollar on that kind of care. And, everything from meditation to acupressure to, you can go on and on and on. So yes.
Fantastic. And I'm going to use this moment just to sort of request that if someone has a question, even if you've already submitted via the web chat, please send it through the Q&A or the question and answer function on Zoom so that I make sure we can track it and try and get it answered for you. So, open question, what do we see as the most promising healthcare AI startups? Not in terms of capital raise, but maybe in terms of implementation of technology, and maybe talk about maybe some of the ones that were promising but failed for X, Y, and Z reasons, because it turns out that tech was not so great, or the idea was not so great.
Can I start real quick? I have a great example. I'm not throwing a name out, but because I don't want to throw them under the bus. But, again, I'm a doctor, okay? Now, I don't have any business training, although I actually, after 60 years, decided I'm getting an EMBA. So, because I have nothing better to do because I'm stuck at my house. So, I try to, again, as an anesthesiologist, I try to make things very simple, right? Because I don't want to make mistakes. I try to be repetitive and use the same workflow all the time. When I started looking at venture capital, and I have a actually a son who's an MBA, is in venture capital. I said to him, you know, to me, there's only three types of companies. There's companies with great ideas and great management teams. There's companies with great ideas and horrible management teams. And then there's the companies that we don't even look at, which are the bad ideas with bad management teams. And I've learned to spend a lot of time, or as much time, looking at the executive team, the founding team, as I do at the clinical aspect of their solution. Because I've learned now several times after doing this a couple of years that without the right team at the helm, that's where a company can fail, even with the best idea. And I've seen that happen now 2 times. And, you know, again, now that I wear the venture capital hat, my response to that is, let's just watch them and we'll buy them at the fire sale because I love the platform. So to me, it's really important as you build out your team, if you're a founder, okay, build it out in a very careful, strategic, calculated way, okay? Don't give away too much stock to people just because they're willing to come on board early, okay? Bring in people who can help you build your business, who can expand your platform, can help you market and sell your product. And take the time to do that, because it's probably the quickest way to kill a company, no matter how great your idea is.
Ev, I want to ask you a question that's sort of related to AI. I think earlier today I heard you say you need to be careful sort of in terms of the labeling and the description of AI in the space, because many times the physicians and surgeons don't want to use it. And it almost sort of seemed a little bit like the analogy that or maybe you said this expressly, but we were talking even earlier, I think, in the conversation about in the CPG space, you know, not using the term artificial. Right. You know, when you're talking about a flavor or something along those lines. Maybe if you could, and all the panelists could unpack a little bit in terms of how you might suggest navigating the use of those words and sort of the branding that you put forward around that technology. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of ways to do it. I mean, just like, you know, the consumer space in many different categories, you know, at the end of the day, these are consumers, whether you think of them as highly trained clinicians or whatnot, they're consumers. You know, the elements that use the word intelligence, you know, machine learning, you know, there are plenty of ways to do it. I think the word artificial intelligence is probably one of the most misused components out there. I mean, it happens to be part of a kind of tail end of a 3-year boom in the venture world. I saw some things about VR that was like 2 booms back already. So, you know, what sort of the fly by night model is every couple of years you get these hype curve booms of technologies. Oftentimes a bunch of venture funds spin up around them. And then, you know, to Gary's point, everybody buys up the little bits and pieces that are left. You know, at the end of the day, you know, I think quality investors like all of us on the panel, you know, we invest in great teams, great tech, whether it's artificial tech, whether it's non-artificial tech. I haven't been able to find an organic intelligence tech company yet, but, you know, if they come up with one with living cells, we're in, you know, there you go. I mean, you know, so
actual neural networks. Yeah,
there you go. Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you know, when we sold an AI security company that we invested in with Sequoia, you know, in 2003, when we went through due diligence with other VCs, we used to joke that they're gnomes in the box, and they're the ones that are just sorting the spam like the post office. And I got to tell you, you know, the founder would deadpan say that to VCs, and a lot more than once or twice they were like, and they went and wrote it down on their paper. So I gotta believe that, you know, you just have to find a way to tell the story about what it does and not use buzzwords. If we see another, you know, email or pitch that's got 30 buzzwords in the first sentence, we're like, whoa, come on. You know, that's not, tell me in one sentence, you know, a great VC, Jean-Louis Gasset, who was one of the founders of Allegis, former president of Apple, was kind of a mentor to me when I was very young. I started in the venture business when I was 30, and he was as a fund manager. And so he was very helpful to me early on. You know, to help kind of frame it up. And he used to say the best deck he ever got was the shortest deck. If you can tell the story in 1 slide, 2 slides, and his famous was they funded a deck on 3 slides. So to me, the simpler the story, and that translates very well to digital, because to a clinician, if you can tell them the story in 1 sentence, in 1 line, and show the value proposition, show why you need it, that's the greatest thing in the world, right? So to me, the best decks in the world are the shortest decks in the world, and can really tell the story.
That's a great way to segue to another question which came in. Maybe Jennifer and Gary can pick this one up, which are, what else would you expect to see or not expect to see from an experienced entrepreneur or from a prepared entrepreneur when they knock on their door? So maybe just 1 or 2 things to do or not do.
Yeah, we actually have on our website, no matter what kind of company you are, I think we have up there profile of a great deal. And it's 1 paragraph highlighting and underlining those 5 or 6 things that you have to have. But definitely, why are you a great, unique team that can solve this hard problem? How big is the market for it? But definitely that, there's the team first, right? Level of experience, professionalism that shows, I mean, Gary mentioned this, it shows they can really steer the ship, because no growth is linear. Spreadsheet forecasts are never accurate. You have to believe that the management team has found an opportunity and has the ability to build a company based on it and get to the end game. But I recommend, we put that profile of a great deal up there. And if you can tell that in as few slides as possible, no more than 12 or 15, you'll probably get the next meeting.
So before Gary answers, I just want to emphasize for the entrepreneurs out there, especially the first timers, if an investor tells you what it is they want to hear or see before you contact them, listen to that. So don't contact Jennifer unless you take a look at that paragraph. And similar for all the other investors who you're interested in, do your diligence, find out maybe folks who've worked with them beforehand. Come prepared. Not just your own company, but understand your audience. I think that's really important information. Sorry to interject.
I would take it a step further. If you're going to connect with Jennifer and pitch her firm, read SC's book. Because if you didn't read SC's book, there might be a quiz, and also if you quote from it liberally, you will all of them will very much like you. Trust me. SC is an amazing venture capitalist, an amazing technologist, and it is worth the read even if you never go pitch Jennifer and her team. By the way.
Yeah, she's she's our managing partner, and she's awesome and writes books and does great events and so forth. So listen to thank you. I'll tell her that. Probably working on the next one amidst 100 other projects.
Gary, something to do or not do as
well, from our perspective, again, we're unique in that we spend so much time on the clinical aspect. You have to get in through our clinical door before you can get anywhere else. And actually, we've spent quite a bit of time on the process and the questions and what we're looking for. We just brought in a new CEO, or I brought in a new CEO about 8 months ago, who's an MD MBA from Columbia. It's another anesthesiologist who I've known for a long time, Oren Aloni-Charas. And Oren has spent a lot of time in the angel environment, looking at companies. He was with Angel MD as one of the original physician founders, and then with Red Crow. And Oren spent a lot of time on the clinical aspect of evaluating these companies. And what we've actually done now is, between our network, and we've actually just built an app that works with our network platform. If you're going to want to pitch to us, we have a series of questions, and they're clinical questions mostly, about tell us what the problem is, what you're solving, what's the addressable market that you're looking at, and give us a little background behind your whatever it is, if it's remote monitoring, or whether it's a workflow platform, or whether it's telemedicine. Give us an idea of what differentiates you in that market from the other 30 companies that just called us yesterday with a similar idea. It's like going to HIMSS, and there's 20 companies all doing the same thing. So for us, that's really important. So to get into our fund, I joke about it. Again, I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm not a primary care. I said, so if you've got a primary care or a surgical solution or a workflow platform, if you can't make me understand what you're doing in like 3 sentences, then you need to go back to the drawing board. So I tend to be the litmus paper if you're going to call me, because, again, I don't know. There's a lot that I don't know as an anesthesiologist, but I have plenty of people who I can go to. So I think that's really important when you're going to look for money, and whether it's angel money or whether it's VC money or whether you're talking to some KOL subject matter expert, I would agree with what's been said. You need to be able to communicate that in 2 or 3 lines. And if you can't, then it's probably too complicated.
That's terrific. So I'm going to try and synthesize a few questions and touch on something which we spoke about earlier, which was telemedicine has really been accelerated, and remote medicine has really been accelerated in this environment. Do we see that continuing? And if so, how does that affect this, potentially telehealth and dentistry? That was actually one question. I don't know if you wrote that in yourself, Gary, or not.
I didn't.
And are there other sort of similar areas that may have been on pause that you think are about to accelerate as we come out of the COVID situation, hopefully?
Is this to me? You want me to start?
Open, whoever would like to speak.
I mean, I'm happy to start. So, we were talking about this earlier before the call. Although the COVID pandemic has created an environment that has accelerated the need, but let's be careful about how we define it. It's been accelerated because it's mandatory now. And that's exactly how EHR succeeded, right? If EHRs had not been mandatory for hospitals, none of them would have spent the $1 billion that they spent to implement the solution.
It goes back to the need to have versus want to have.
Exactly.
Right,
yeah. Right. And the best investment is always something that you have to do, right? So, I mean, we'll all agree on that from a pure business perspective. So when it comes to digital health, yes, we've created this market, we've accelerated the market, but what we've also done is show how greatly unprepared we were to make this transition, because the solutions that have been put in place were not really as adaptable as they needed to be to handle the volume and the workflow that's necessary. And we talked about this earlier on, it's a completely separate conversation. So what's really going to be important with digital health moving forward, even with or without the pandemic, is to now yet again go back to the clinicians, go back to the decision makers and figure out, okay, here's where we are now. How do we take what we have and optimize it in a way like we've done with electronic healthcare records over the last 10 years, optimize it in a way that results in very basic things: increased efficiency, improved workflow, decreased cost, and increased access. And the nice thing about digital health, which I love, is that unlike many other businesses, digital health was made to deploy globally, okay, which solves so many social impact issues. So even if we can pay for it, there are places remotely in the world where we will now, from a surgical perspective, from a delivery perspective, be able to deliver the highest levels of care with the same providers that are delivering it in a very highly reimbursed market to places where there are countries that don't even have access. And to me, and again, that's why we call ourselves an impact fund, because everything that we do, yes, we're there to make money. We are a for-profit, but we are a global network. And we're very focused as clinicians to making it available globally in places that don't have it now.
I think, yeah, I totally agree. I would expect temporarily, some of the things we'll see is pent-up demand for non-essential healthcare, even slightly essential healthcare. There's a big pent-up demand. It takes forever to get a dentist appointment now. So we'll have to work through all of that as things open up more and more. On the telemedicine side, I think those of us in Silicon Valley, New York, Dallas, Texas, Seattle, Washington that have been using it, we'll probably start going back into the office when we're able to. But to Gary's point, now that these products and services have been built out, hopefully that can really extend the accessibility of quality healthcare to the communities that don't have it. We may find we have a shortage of suppliers now, of course, but hopefully it's like a product that now can be used more mainstream and mainstream really high quality healthcare to more people. That's what I would love to see. So, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'll
There has to be a
dovetail-
bit of a will. There has to be the will to make that happen. But
Yeah.
the companies, but the companies chasing this opportunity now may find they need to make that pivot when the world starts to look normal again,
Right.
until the next pandemic. And there will be another one in my lifetime, I'm sure of it. Like, human beings are now the invasive species. And we're overpopulated, we're infringing on where the bats and the pangolins live and other, things. And these viruses are going to keep growing and mutate. We're going to have it again, right? And we have throughout human history. So, but things accelerate so much that we just need to be resilient to the next time, and to the extent that we're willing and plan for the long term. So.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a bit of a unique perspective on telehealth. I mean, I've actually been involved in telehealth since 1994. Gary's probably the last person who remembers a company called Medical Manager, which was really one of the first true ERP platforms in the world in the mid 90s. I was a digital, media entrepreneur. They were one of our customers, as well as Genentech and everybody else. And we built out of our IT side one of the first telehealth platforms. We also built the UI UX for Cisco's first telehealth platform, which I'm sure everybody might remember. That was like $1 zillion and worth sometimes. So, at the end of the day, this has been around a really long time. This has really evolved. And if an entrepreneur wants to think about telehealth, there are standard platforms, right? This is like, you build an app for an iPhone on an iOS. You build an app for an Android on an Android. There are standards out there that are already, in the market. And you need to go work with those, whether it's, Teladoc, Livongo, whether it's SnapMD, that was our folks, that already have significant reach into the health system. They're already implemented. They already are baked in. If you're building a vertical app, you build a vertical app on top of a platform. If you're trying to build the platform and trying to build the app at the same time, you're trying to, boil the ocean. If you can get existing tech out of the box to do most of it, look, if you're building a mental health telehealth platform, just getting the mental health part down is what it's all about. You don't need to go build the telehealth platform to do it. You need to get the mental health thing down. If you're doing addiction, if you're doing dermatology, get that down right before you do it. And to Gary's point as well, I mean, look, telehealth, believe it or not, I mean, rural communities are the #1 users of telehealth in the United States of America. I mean, people in big cities are spoiled. We are rich. We get to go to doctors all the time. Even if you're not rich here, you get to go to a doctor. If your child has, or your partner has a terrible disease and you live in even 150 miles out of Oklahoma City, your access to healthcare is zero, bagel, nothing. So you need telehealth because the nearest specialist is probably in Houston, and that's what it's like these days. It's terrible. I don't mean to be, ranking on Oklahoma per se, but that being said, pick whatever rural community you like and plug that in. And then, extend that to Uzbekistan and the Philippines and every other Southeast Asian company. And then ultimately China,
Yeah, I'd like to say one other thing. I'm just going to add into it because I think this is hugely important related to this subject, is we tend to think of it, we've been forced into this environment right now, and we're very focused on black and white. There's face-to-face care, and then there's telecare, okay? But there's a huge gray zone between the two, to what I refer to, and Doug Sumaraga, who's a CTO that is involved with us, he coined this term, maybe. It's called clicks and mortar, okay? Between face-to-face care and total digital care is clicks and mortar. And that's where remote monitoring, extenders come in, the whole dental telemedicine idea. That's the perfect example of it, right? There has to be a way, like bridge funding, there has to be a way to bridge the two, okay? And what that means is we have elderly populations that can't leave their home before, after, and during COVID. We have pediatric moms that are stuck with sick babies at the house who don't have access to necessarily get to a urgent care facility or a pediatrician. And we have devices that are being developed. We're looking at least 10 different devices. Digital otoscopes that can make diagnoses of bacterial versus viral middle ear infections. Crazy stuff that you would never even think would be out there, okay? And if we can take that remote monitoring, put it in a backpack, and deploy to the point of care an extender, either an LVN or a nurse practitioner or a dental hygienist, to go out and get to the point of care, use those devices to deliver the data to the provider who's now sitting in a single location, and then using either machine learning or decision support, very easily triage and decide and make a diagnosis with a provider at the point of care, which is necessary many times. That already takes our current delivery system and makes it much more efficient, and it will significantly reduce the cost of healthcare. It'll reduce the unnecessary urgent care, ED visits, all of that. I mean, Uber could put together a system like that just by sending Uber drivers with a provider driving around town with these remote backpacks. So I think as investors, as idea generators, as founders of companies, it's really important, if you're going to be in this digital healthcare space, to adopt in your mind the idea that my delivery system has to involve all of that, not just one or the other, because if it doesn't, you're going to be very limited in your addressable market and your ability to generate revenue.
That's fantastic, Gary. With that, we are out of time today. I'm going to have Rob Lau come back on to say goodbye, but I want to thank each of our panelists. It was very exciting and very informative. Gary Goldman, Jennifer Vancini, and Ephraim Lindenbaum. Rob?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. This has been Idea to IPO. I hope you found it informative. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Be well.
Yes, be safe and well.